Good evening, everybody. Thanks very much for coming in and welcome. Tonight we have our friend Mark Egerton back with us again, and we've also got Jennifer joining us again from across the pond. Tonight we are going to be talking about one of Mark's favourite locations and one of his specialities, Hingingbrooke House. So thanks for coming in, Jennifer. But big thanks, Mark, for coming back to see us yet again. So Hingingbrooke House, its history goes back, I was going to say decades, it's centuries. So in your own time, buddy, it is a fascinating place, and tell us how about, kind of origins. I said orange there, sorry. The origins of Hingingbrooke.
Basically it's in it was in the county of Huntingdonshire. The county town is Huntingdon and it's based in Huntingdon. But in 1974, Huntingdonshire was absorbed into Cambridgeshire. But the Huntingdonshire then became a district of Cambridgeshire rather than a county in its own right. But it retained its name really because of its history. The most famous history is that Oliver Cromwell was born in Huntingdon, and obviously he was involved in the English Civil War, and he was the guy responsible for chopping off King Charles I's head. And obviously for Parliament and most of us getting a vote, when prior to that, the King collected taxes and used the taxes as he saw fit. And Cromwell was opposed to that and said that people who have paid these taxes should get something in return. And so, he's really the origin of our British Parliament. So there's a big statue of him outside. But he was actually born a mile from where I was born, in the town of Huntingdon, in the main high street, in fact. But also within Huntingdonshire, Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of King Henry VIII, she died in Huntingdonshire. And in the UK, you probably know better than Jennifer, there's a very famous diarist called Samuel Pepys who kept a diary. And these diaries contain details of some very important historic events that happened in a 9-year period, namely the Dutch invading London. They were sailing up the Thames, the Great Plague of London, and the Great Fire that followed the plague. But at the time, only 2% of people roughly in the country could read and write. Pepys was a meticulous writer of details. And so he spent a lot of his time in Huntingdonshire because his uncle here, his dad's brother. And so his early education was in Huntingdonshire. He later became on to be involved with Hingingbrooke House, funnily enough, because the Montague family, who were living in Hingingbrooke House at the time, held that they were the Lord of the Admiralty. And Pepys, because of his meticulous secretarial skills, was appointed secretary to the Admiralty. So he spent a great deal of his time with the Montagues. John Montague, the fourth Earl of Sandwich, who was actually the Lord of the Admiralty at the time. They were related as well, I think, through one of the wives of the Montagues. But Pepys had a lot of links with Hingingbrooke. So basically, Huntingdonshire, although it no longer exists as a county, it's now part of nearby Cambridgeshire. It's about 18 miles from Cambridge, but it's retained its name. It makes up about 25% of the county of Cambridgeshire. Cambridgeshire is a pretty big county. It takes about an hour and a half to drive from one side to the other, which is probably nothing to Jennifer in a country the size of the USA. But in the UK, to drive across a county and it takes 90 minutes is quite a big county, isn't it, Scott?
Jennifer, what's the average county in America? What's the kind of driving time, would you say, the average kind of size?
I can give you the average driving time based in California. I don't know what the average driving time would be to drive across the United States. I know it'd take days. California, from mid-California down to, say, LA, takes about anywhere from 8 to, I don't know, 10 hours, depending on traffic. And
So
that's
it's
just
pretty
local.
big.
Oh yeah, I did a fly drive there where I landed at LA, and then I drove to Palm Springs and then Las Vegas, and then I went to the Sequoia and Yosemite National Parks, and then ended up back in San Francisco where I flew home. It's a lot bigger than the UK.
You were all over the place. Oh my God.
Yeah, we were there for about 3.5 weeks, did a lot of driving. But getting back to Hingingbrooke, as I said, it started life as a church in the 10th, 11th century. It was a wooden church, and there were some nuns at a priory or an abbey, however you want to use the term. Generally, we call it a priory, and their priory was about 5-10 miles away, and they wanted a larger priory, and so they asked for permission for the Bishop of Lincoln, who basically was in charge of the whole of what we call East Anglia, the east of England, and asked if they could convert this church that was falling to bits into a Benedictine priory. And that happened around 1170, and then it stayed as a priory until 1536, when King Henry VIII fell out with the Catholic religion. He wanted a divorce from Queen Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, who he'd been married to for well over 20 years. And the primary religion in the UK was Catholicism, and the Catholic Pope in Italy wouldn't grant him a divorce. And so he said, right, you can, I'm going to dissolve all the monasteries and do away with the Catholic religion. I'm going to start my own religion, which will be called the Church of England, and I'm going to be the head of it. And as I'm the head of it, if I want a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, I shall have a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. He was married to Catherine, his first wife, longer than the 5 wives that followed put together. He was with her a very long time. And she ended up, funnily enough, quite close to Hingingbrooke House. She was about 3-4 miles away from Hingingbrooke House in a place called Buckton Towers. And she later got moved to Kimbolton Castle, which is about 12 miles west of me. And she died there in 7th of January 1536. But obviously, when Henry dissolved all the monasteries in England, that didn't happen right. It started in 1536, but it took him about 4 to 5 years to shut them all down. And then these beautiful priories became prime real estate, really. And so he sold it off to a lot of the lords and ladies and landed gentry, mainly his friends, for what was quite a considerable sum of money in those days. Hingingbrooke sold for about £20, and that's just not the house, that's the estate. On that estate now there is a hospital, a police headquarters, a huge country park, and it was bought by a family called the Cromwell family. They lived there for about three generations. During that time, they welcomed King James I from Scotland. When he took the throne and came down to London, he stopped at Hingingbrooke, and he loved Hingingbrooke, the hospitality he received, and in particular the hunting. He was a hunter, and Huntingdonshire was full of forests and things like that, and so he loved Hingingbrooke, and he returned regularly. And the Cromwells were so sort of keen to lavishly entertain the king, they basically ran out of money and were forced to sell the property, and they sold it to a family called the Montague family, who were up and coming at the time. In fact, the nearby Kimbolton Castle, which I mentioned, was actually owned by the Montague family already. They held the title the Dukes of Manchester, and the guy who moved into Hingingbrooke was called Sidney Montague, and it was his brother who owned Kimbolton who bought the house. And Sidney had lived in the nearby county of Northamptonshire, and tragically his son had drowned in the estate where they lived, and so they didn't really want to stay there. It was unhappy memories. And his brother, who owned Kimbolton Castle, was keen to acquire a forest. That he wasn't really interested in Hingingbrooke House because he was living in Kimbolton Castle. And so what he did basically was he bought the house and gave it to his brother. And then roughly about 50, 60 years, his brother's family, side of the family, were awarded the title the Earls of Sandwich. And this was after a place called Sandwich in Kent. And there was 9 Earls of Sandwich who lived at Hingingbrooke for about 350, 360 years. But it was the 4th Earl, John Montague, who basically was the Lord of the Admiralty. He was Lord of the Admiralty, so he spent a lot of time in London. And he picked up a mistress in London, a very beautiful young lady who was on the team called Martha Ray. And he put his own wife into a mental asylum under the pretense that she was mentally ill, and moved this Martha Ray in with him. She was 25 years odd younger than him. So he had this young mistress, and they lived together there as man and wife. And John was quite a character. He is accredited in inventing the sandwich that we eat, the snack. He was a gambler. Yeah, he wouldn't leave the gambling table for 24 hours. And they said, look, you must eat. And he said, bring me meat between 2 slices of bread. And that supposedly is how the sandwich got its name and how it was invented by him, basically because he wouldn't leave the poker table. So yeah, he was Lord of the Admiralty. He sponsored all the voyages of Captain James Cook. Captain James Cook discovered places like what you call the Hawaiian Islands now. If you actually look them up, you'll see that they were originally christened by Cook as the Sandwich Islands, after the Earl of Sandwich, John Montague, who'd sponsored his voyages. I think there's some islands off Australia there as well that are basically called Hingingbrooke, and were christened in his honour by Cook, in respect for him sponsoring him to do his voyages around the world. So yeah, the Montagues were there for about 350, 60 years, and then they too ran out of money. And round about the early 1960s, they were basically skint. And so they sold the house and the estate to Huntingdon District Council, and it was in a very bad condition. And it took them a few years to decide what to do with it, and they basically had it restored. And this place is old, so the walls are probably 2-3 foot thick in places. So they had to have proper stonemasons do it, and they basically turned it into a school. It's a comprehensive school, so it's a public school which anybody can go to. I was fortunate enough to go there, and in my last 2 years, I spent my time in the house, 77, 78. And the house basically is still a school. It's on just over 50 years. It's been a school. And it basically the house is built on what was the priory. It's been extended around it, but the rear of the house dates back to around about 1170. There has been numerous sightings and paranormal events there, normally nuns. There has been a monk seen there in one of the particular rooms. The TV show Paranormal Lockdown came and filmed an episode in the summer of 1978, which they asked me to get involved with. So, it's got a long haunted history, which is well known. And because of the COVID situation, it's never really been properly investigated. They've had big commercial groups in there taken 60 plus people in there at a time, but it's never been properly investigated in a controlled investigation. And they asked me, why that was, and I said, well, to be honest, you're charging too much money. They were charging £1,200 to hire it, and it's a beautiful place. It's huge, and you can see why it would command that sort of money. But your average paranormal team of, I don't know, 10 to 15 people, that's just way beyond their budget. And so they've come up with a plan, or they asked me to come up with a plan so that it would appeal to serious paranormal investigation teams. And so what they've agreed is that from 2022, next January, as you know, Scott, they're going to allow one Saturday a month for a paranormal team to come in. And there is a minimum order quantity, but it basically works out around about 30 or 35 pounds, depending on how many people you bring in per head, which is doable. People are paying 50, 60 quid to go into these places with large commercial ghost hunting groups, and you can actually come in, do your own investigation, work in your own way in the rooms that the Paranormal Lockdown team. These were rooms like the cellar, which just looks like it's stood still in time. If you go down there, it's probably much the same as it was 400 or 500 years ago. It had never been investigated for health and safety reasons. Other rooms in the property had never been investigated, basically because they were too small for the numbers of people that were going in there. I did some tours around the house quite recently, and the way I got around it was I took 30 people, but I left half of them in a room being entertained, 15 people at a time into these rooms. So we feel, or I feel, that these rooms now, for a reasonable sized paranormal team, 10 to 15 people, you could quite easily go in there and do an investigation. If you went in there with, say, 2 teams of 15 people, it's big enough for you to do an investigation in one part of the house while the other team does an investigation in the other part of the house. And these restricted areas like the cellar that featured on Paranormal Lockdown, and these smaller rooms that basically were never opened because they were so small, are now doable. So I said, people have watched the paranormal episode in the UK. It's one of the most popular of the UK ones. Give people the opportunity to go in the same rooms as Nick Groff and Katrina Weidman. So that's what they're doing. So hopefully we're going to start promoting that probably later this month. From January, as you know, you're interested in it. They're going to start taking teams in there, and they've asked me to just walk people around the house because it's a huge place. In the dark, you would easily get lost if you're not familiar with the place because it's so big. And just take them around for half an hour, show them it, and say, right, there you go. Off you go. Investigate however you investigate. You've got a huge house here with 1,000 years of history. You're in here from 7 p.m. in the evening. You've got till 2 o'clock tomorrow morning. You get on with it and do your own thing. I'll be in the background if you get lost or you get stuck or you have any questions. But basically, I'm not involved with the investigation. There is nearby an old medieval bridge that's probably haunted, and we're going to give people the option. These are just options that they can have. They can sort of watch the episode of Paranormal Lockdown, which is about 35 minutes without the ad breaks. Would certainly put them in the mood for doing an investigation, or they can at one stage at say 1 a.m. in the morning, I could take them down to Nuns Bridge, which is about 300 miles away, and that's, as the name suggests, is allegedly haunted by a nun, and it's probably the most oldest and famous ghost story in Huntingdonshire. But if it's absolutely terrible weather, they probably won't want to do that. So they've basically got the option to come in from 7 p.m. till 2 a.m. in the morning and explore this house and all the rooms in it that featured in the Paranormal Lockdown episode, and get into these rooms that were either shut off for health and safety reasons or were deemed too small for a large body of people to go in.
And
So
we're absolutely over the moon that we're going to be the first team, 29th of January. I think it's the date we agreed.
yes,
But Paranormal History are going to be the first team to go in and do our thing, investigate and filming it, and the whole team's buzzing over it because you say, Mark, Paranormal Lockdown was the last team to go in. So there's a few years gap, and we're at the moon that we're going to be the first. No, it's not a case of we're going to be first. It's a case of that we're getting the opportunity to go in and do it. And I will put my hands up. Being first is, it's a big thing for us. You see a big smile.
I'm jealous.
Sorry. Jennifer's very jealous of us in the UK because we've got a lot more history over here than she has.
Looking at the blueprints of this house, and I'm jealous.
it's the photo. Well, you've seen the photographs, Scott. It's a fantastic house. It's basically a Tudor country home. There's things in there that date back to Henry VIII. It's older than Henry VIII. It was a priory before it was a home. We're talking 1170. The priory arrived there. There are still bits of the building that are the original priory from 1170. So, I was asked to give people some tours around the house and tell them the history. And I was asked to do a tour. It sold out in a day. So I was asked to do another one. That sold out in a day. And in the end, I did 4 tours in 4 consecutive weeks, 4 3-hour tours, quite exhausting. But the only way I could do it was to leave. There was 30 people. Just leave half of them in a room being entertained. I had a psychic medium there. I had a lady who works in my team who douses with crystals. And I had the artist who'd drawn the images in my book that I couldn't photograph. Things like Catherine of Aragon, obviously, I couldn't take a photograph of her. And when you're writing a book, there are copyright issues. So I couldn't put anything in the book that I didn't have the copyright or the permission to put in. The National Portrait Gallery wanted £3,000 for me to use one of their images of Catherine of Aragon, and so in the end, I could buy a postcard of her, but I didn't. I owned the postcard, but not the image rights. So what you had to do was buy the postcard and then employ a local artist to draw her herself. And I said to her, basically draw her likeness as she looked, but all these historical paintings are very drab browns and greys because they didn't have the sort of colours that we see today in paintings. So Catherine of Aragon was known for her, dressing quite vibrantly and colourfully. She was Spanish. And so I said to the artist, look, draw her, I gave you artistic license, draw her face accurately, but the colour of her clothes, I don't want it to represent these colours in the portraits. I want it to represent the colours that she would have really worn. And things like sort of poltergeist activity, extreme poltergeist activity. I couldn't take a photo of that. And so I got this local artist to draw an image for me. So my book has got about 300 images in it, but there's about 25 of them that I just couldn't take a photo of. And so I employed this local artist to draw them for me. Able also to be able to tweak them slightly to give personality traits. For instance, Catherine of Aragon was a skilled lace maker. She was taught to make lace, and so
it's never far from myself.
It's a big book, isn't it?
It's a heavy. Excuse the language. It's a heavy bugger.
Yeah. I sent a copy to Melbourne in Australia recently. The book is $24.99. And it was £24 to post it as well. because it's so heavy. So what I'm looking to do at the moment is get it. It's on Amazon in a Kindle format, but most people say, oh, you know, you've got to have the book in your hand because it's such a big, heavy book. So what I'm hoping to do is get it on Amazon in a hard copy, and so that, you know, people who've got Amazon Prime won't have to pay the postage, because it's such a, even in the UK, it's £6 to post that to the UK. The publisher has sent all these copies out, and you know, to put a book in an envelope and post it, it's not cheap. I think the States, I've sent loads to the States. I think the States is about £20. So when you've got to pay nearly double the price of the book to get it, it makes sense to have a look at getting it onto Amazon if I can. As I said, the Kindle is on there. The Kindle's there, but personally, I don't think the Kindle is exactly the same book, but when you've got the book in the hand, it just feels a little bit more, I think.
It's a fair one. I'm just going to pop up some of these comments. Frankie say, are you sure you're allowed to come south of the border? We are, Frankie, as you're concerned. We're actually just back we were down at Nottingham at the weekend at Sherwood Forest, filming with GSI. So we did venture south of the border. Laura's saying that sounds amazing about Hingingbrooke House. Melissa Louise Davis, so she went to school at Hingingbrooke as well. I don't know if you know her.
Well, she's probably married, so I don't recall a Melissa, but I knew quite a lot of people. I was there for 6 years, so yeah, it is a lovely house. I'm sure that Melissa will agree with me on that. And said, because it's such a big house, they hire it out for private weddings and charge about £5,000, I think, for the day. Obviously, that all stopped during the COVID pandemic. So they want to get the house, because it costs an absolute fortune to run it. As I said, in some places, the walls are 2 or 3 foot thick. And so if you need any work doing, you have to have proper stonemasons in there. You can't just get your local bricklayer to come in and do the work for you. It's a listed building, so the work has to be done sympathetically with the age of the building in mind by specialist professionals. So it costs an absolute fortune. There's a painting on the wall.
It's the history behind it.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mark.
When you come down, Scott, there's a picture on the wall, a hand-painted picture, huge picture that dates back to King Henry VIII's time. And that is slowly disappearing because of acid rain and damp on the walls. It could be saved, but it's just such a lot of money. You know, when people are dying from COVID and, you know, all the money's being pumped into vaccines and saving lives. So, you know, this painting, you know, if unless something changes, it's not going to be round there, you know, for people's grandchildren to see.
Hopefully it's there in January.
Yeah. Oh, it'll be there in January, definitely. Yeah, I can assure you that.
It's the history of the place. I mean, obviously the paranormal side fascinates us, but it's the history of the building that really fascinates me. Especially, I mean, everybody knows Sarah and I are both big Tudor fans. You know, we have been I've been for many years. It's the ties to Henry VIII and what have been, Catherine of Aragon, because I think, you know, well, all Henry's wives got a bit of a raw deal, but I think Catherine was she got the kind of raw deal through, you know, through all. She was basically dumped for Anne Boleyn. No offence to Anne Boleyn. And so the whole Henry VIII thing is really a big thing for me. Melissa, may I have a location for you guys to investigate before an exorcism is carried out. It's in Chatteris.
That's not far from me. I know Chatteris quite well.
Drop us a wee mail, hon, Melissa, and can say I'll have a look at it. That'd be excellent.
Or if Melissa comes onto my Facebook page, the book has got its own Facebook group. I don't know if she's a member, called The Haunted History of Huntingdonshire. I'd be interested to hear about that, because I don't know a great deal about Chatteris, because it's I think it's regarded as fenland, so it's just on the sort of borders between what we call Huntingdonshire and what we call Fenland. For those who don't know, this part of East Anglia was actually underwater during the time of Henry VIII's time. It was marshland, and it was drained, and places like there was just islands. Ramsey, which is not too far from where Catherine of Aragon died, in her time, it wasn't part of the UK mainland. It was about a mile from the land because it was underwater. So Ramsey was an island about a mile from the UK mainland in Catherine of Aragon's time. And in fact, when she died, I think it was the 7th of January 1536 at Kimbolton Castle, nobody to this day knows the true cause of her death. Some people believe that it was a form of cancer. She had a blackened heart, apparently, and some people think that Henry poisoned her. But the general consensus is she had a form of cancer. But there are others who say that she succumbed to the harsh Fenland climate because, as I said, surrounded with water, it was very damp, very cold in the winter, and it wasn't the most pleasant place to live. No central heating in Kimbolton Castle at that time. There would have just been hot, and so yeah, she perished at Kimbolton Castle. She was originally at Buckton Towers, which is about 2 miles north of me, and she was there for almost a year. And because of her lace making skills, she became very popular because she taught the local people how to make lace. So that gave them a trade and an income. And that Henry didn't like that, and so he wanted her moved, and he sent in the Duke of Norfolk and Suffolk to move her. And the local people in the village of Buckton repelled them and said, no, you're not having her. We love her. Henry doesn't want her. We do. And so the Duke of Norfolk and the Duke of Suffolk had to go back to London and tell Henry that they hadn't been able to move Queen Catherine. And so I think 2 or 3 months later, Henry returned with a small army and moved her 12 miles to the west of me to Kimbolton Castle. She was there really for the last 2 years of her life, and Kimbolton Castle is where she died and also where she haunts. Obviously, it's in Huntingdonshire, so I featured it in a book. Kimbolton Castle is equally as magnificent as Hingingbrooke House, as you've probably seen, Scott, from the pictures in the book. Unfortunately, Kimbolton Castle is now a very prestigious private school. It's got Arab princes there who pay about £15,000 a term or some stupid amount of money. They're not keen on having paranormal investigations or having the paranormal there. In fact, when I featured Kimbolton Castle in my book, they were happy for me to talk about historical sightings because Catherine of Aragon is supposed to haunt there, and she is generally only seen from the chest upwards. And this is because over the centuries, the floor levels have changed. The floor levels that she would have stood on were a lot lower. So people generally, when she's been witnessed, the most famous sighting happened during the Second World War because they had a load of army troops camping in the grounds, and a number of them saw this ghost, and it caused quite a to-do at the time. But yeah, she has been seen on a few occasions there at Kimbolton Castle, but the cause of her death is still to this day unknown for certain. Speculation is it was cancer. Blackened heart, some people say Henry had her poisoned. Other people say that it was just the cold fen climate that she was in at the time. They drained the fens now, and that goes out 60, 80 miles east of me now. Is still land. That would have all been underwater in Catherine of Aragon's time, or mainly marshland.
I've heard the poison theory quite a few times, and
yeah,
I mean, I dare say he was a king, so basically he could do what he wanted, basically, because I know after the divorce.
Yeah, he was very cruel because they had a daughter together, Mary, who became known as Bloody Mary when she took the throne herself. And Mary wasn't allowed to visit her mother at Kimbolton. She wasn't allowed to go to her mother's funeral when she died. Henry wouldn't visit. So he was quite cruel man.
It was.
Allowing his not to go to her own mother's funeral. But
Well, it
basically,
shows. Sorry, Mark, carry on.
he basically wanted shot of her, and he then went on to have another 5 wives, and the 5 wives, their time with Henry combined is nothing like the time. I can't remember the exact time, but I think he was married to Catherine of Aragon. Incidentally, a lot of people don't realise she was actually married previously to Henry's brother. I think his name was Alfred, if I remember rightly. And they got married at a very early age. Alfred, I think, was about 15. And he succumbed to an illness called the sweating sickness, which was very much like the Great Plague. And he died. They'd only been married a matter of months. And the King of Spain and his queen had paid rather a large dowry for Catherine to come from Spain to England to marry into the English royal Tudor family. And a way of keeping that dowry, that large amount of money they were paid, was to pair her off with his younger brother Henry. And she was slightly older than Henry, but they said that the marriage to Henry's brother, who died at around 15, was never consummated, so it wasn't a valid marriage. So that marriage was allowed to take place, but when Henry had enough of Catherine and wanted a divorce, under the pretense that she couldn't give him a child, I think they had about 5 children together, boys and girls, but the only one that survived infancy was the daughter Mary, who later became known in history as Bloody Mary. She was the only child that survived from that relationship. So Henry just sort of kept moving on to different women, I think, and when he got fed up with them, he sort of chopped their heads off, really.
Basically, because Mary, hi Justin, buddy, thanks, because Mary was quite a strong Catholic. Then, of course, Elizabeth, she, Anne's daughter, she was Protestant, and so Mary was very, very strict in her, her views and her way of life. And Henry even threatened her with execution when she refused to sign the oath. Well, he didn't threaten her directly; he done it in a kind of roundabout way. But basically, he was saying, sign it, or. But then he backtracked on that. He done a double take on that and changed his mind. So she was good, and then, as I say, she became known as Bloody Mary, simply because she basically, because of her treatment of the Protestants, when she took the throne.
Getting back to Hingingbrooke House, what's very interesting there is, it featured very much in the English Civil War. I said to you that King James I was a regular visitor to Hingingbrooke. He slept there quite often. But other royals, monarchs that have been there, King Charles I, who was fighting against Oliver Cromwell, that ironically was born sort of around about, I would say probably 3 to 5 miles down the road from Hingingbrooke House. He was born in Huntingdon. And Cromwell was basically the man responsible for King Charles I being executed. The family that came in there afterwards, the Cromwells lived there, the Montagues, they too were a split family. Some of them supported the parliamentary cause, and some of them, in fact, one of the Montagues was responsible. I don't know how good your history is on Charles I, but Charles I was executed. When Cromwell died, he was buried in Westminster Cathedral, like a royal, basically, although he never took on the mantle of king. He took on the title of Lord Protector. And the sort of power passed to his son, who was a bit of a limp lettuce, really. And that allowed Charles I's son, Charles II, who basically fled to France, to come back and reclaim the monarchy. And the Montague family were a very naval family, and they were responsible for the boat that brought Charles II back to England from France. And basically he reclaimed his crown. But he was so bitter that Cromwell had killed his father, he had Cromwell dug up about 2 years after he was dead, and he hanged him and chopped his head off. And then Cromwell's head, there's a book on it itself that his head moved. It was put on Westminster Hall on a pike as an example, where it stood for nearly over 20 years, and then it fell off in a storm and sort of travelled around, and it ended up here back in Cambridgeshire in about 1960s, and it's buried at the university which Cromwell attended in Cambridge.
Mm-hmm. That's a bit of
Cromwell's head is probably, I think, more interesting than the Civil War. Obviously not as many casualties involved, but it's a hell of a story. You can buy books just on his head, what happened to him 2 years after he died. It's unbelievable. Yeah, it's very interesting.
I knew that. Jennifer, would you make a Hingingbrooke House? Now you've heard Mark and saw the blueprints kind of thing.
Oh, because I was looking at the blueprints of what he was talking about the size and everything. I was like, so I was curious on what you meant by the size of rooms and things like that. And I'm like, wow. So certain things like pantries, larders, I can see where they're small. Where the larger rooms, I noticed, are quite large. So, no, I understand now. I'm like, okay, so exactly how tiny are these rooms? I'm like, okay, it makes a lot more sense now.
Probably, I don't know if you're looking at the blueprints, but probably the inner hall and what they call the assembly room, you could quite comfortably fit 50, 70 people in there in those rooms. And there are other rooms nearby where you struggle to get 15, 20 people in them. So if you take a big group of people in there, which these commercial ghost companies were having to do to recoup the £1,200 that they'd spent to hire the house for the night. So they'd have probably 50 plus people going in there at £60 a head. They could never open these rooms to them because they were too small.
Yeah, I only could find the blueprints of the lower level. I couldn't find anything above. So
yeah, the cellars basically, until fairly recently, had no lighting, and the cellars run underneath the house, so you can imagine the size of the cellars. And very famously in the Paranormal Lockdown episode, Nick Groff spent the night on his camp bed in one of the cellars, so it featured quite heavily in that program. And the public generally, even these commercial ghost hunting groups, because of health and safety, there was no lighting. The floor levels are brick. Some of the bricks have dropped. So if you're sort of running around there in the dark, it's very dangerous. So from a health and safety perspective, they wouldn't allow it to happen. So I basically said, if you want me to take people around, I want to show them these rooms. So they've put some lighting in the cellars. It's still pretty dark down there. But it's a certain atmosphere to it when you turn the lights off. I can tell you it's pitch black, absolutely pitch black. There's an old ice house down there where they used to keep meat with the sort of metal rods that big sides of beef and venison would hang on. There's all these coved walls where they would keep cheeses, where they would keep wine, champagne, and this is all underground. And in its day, when the Montagues sold it, there's secret passageways that run from the library to the cellars, not for any sort of real reason other than that the Montagues would have probably spent a lot of time in their library, and it was just a shortcut to the cellars rather than having to walk all the way around this big house to go through the main cellar door. You could just sort of nip through a secret panel in the library, and there were steps down in the cellar. But when the house was sold, those steps had gone. So if you slid back the secret panel and stepped out, you had a 12-foot drop. You'd probably break your ankles or something. So, yeah, it certainly wasn't. It wasn't safe for people to go down there. But it's now. Sorry.
I was looking at the stained glass windows next. Sorry. I was looking at at how the outside look of the house, and I was like, well, what are those? And like, oh, stained glass windows. So I started like zooming in, going, oh, those are beautiful.
Yeah, the majority of those are in the library, and that is what basically where the old church was, sort of 10th, 11th century. That is the oldest part of the house, and it's the back of the house, where most of this has gone on. And right at the very back in the gardens is where that white lady that Scott showed on the front of the book has been seen. And nobody knows who she is. But what's most interesting about her, I don't know if you can see it from the front of the book, is she's said to glow. She's supposed to be very beautiful. She's very upset. She seems to be crying. Nobody can hear a noise from her. But the most thing about her is the people who've witnessed her said she seems to be fluorescing, giving off light. One of the most famous sightings happened in 1959. A guy described her, he said it was like she had a spotlight behind her and it was sort of shining out from her body. So I know all this history about the place because when I was researching my book, I wanted to find out who she might be. And so I had this clever idea. Well, I thought it was clever at the time, to research all the residents that had lived in Hingingbrooke as far back as records would allow me to. So I ended up going back to the best part of 1,000 years to try and find clues to who she might be. And I couldn't find anything that was really, 100% certain. But from knowing the history of the house, I think she may well be John Montague, the fourth Earl's mistress, Martha Ray, because he put his wife into a mental asylum so that he could move his mistress in with him. A lot of people suspected that there wasn't a great deal wrong with his wife. She was quite a quiet, very plain-looking woman, and he had her put in to a mental institution near Windsor in London. And very nice mental institution, but he basically moved her there and moved Martha Ray, his mistress in London, in with him. He was spending a lot of time in London because he was Lord of the Admiralty, and so he took on this Martha when she was 17. I think she was a good 25 years younger than him. Very stunningly beautiful woman, and men sort of worshipped her. But karma came to bite him back because she was murdered on the steps of Covent Garden Opera House by a jealous suitor, a man called the Reverend James Hackman. He was an ex-army clergyman, and he fell in love with her like many people did. And he was the same age as her, and he tried to woo her away and say, what do you want to be with that old man for? Come with me. And she said, I couldn't possibly leave. It's the Earl of Sandwich. He's Lord of the Admiralty. And so she was a talented singer. She came out of Covent Garden Opera House in London, and this Hackman accosted her and shot her in the face from about a yard away, killed her instantly, then turned a gun on himself, and it either misfired or the bullet ricocheted off his skull and didn't pierce it. And he was arrested immediately and hanged for the crime. But Montague was devastated. He'd lost his love, Martha. They had 5 children together. They lived at Hingingbrooke as man and wife. They were never married, but they had 5 children and went around as man and wife. And his real wife was in a mental institution where many people felt there was nothing wrong with her. So, sign of the times.
No, I'm kind of curious. Yeah. That during the wars, World War I, World War II, did the house suffer any damages from the wars?
Not that I'm aware of. These big houses, places like Hingingbrooke House, Kimbolton Castle, they played a big part in the war effort. Even Buckton Towers, where I told you Catherine of Aragon was originally when she came here, that was set up as a hospital for First World War officers who'd been injured. It was like a rest and recuperation, and there was a sort of mini hospital nearby. But yes, I mentioned to you in the Second World War, Kimbolton Castle, they had troops stationed within the castle at the time. So Hingingbrooke also, I think, was used for military purposes.
So this was a common
quite
thing.
interesting. Yeah, what was quite interesting about Hingingbrooke, as I said, the Montagues were there for about 350 years, and they eventually sold it in the early 60s. But after the Second World War, the ninth Earl, so this is, you're talking 1946, 1947, so not 100 years ago, he had the west wing extension of the house knocked down because he believed it was inhabited by a werewolf. And this is honestly,
Oh my
and
God.
the building was demolished, and that was the reason that was given. Now, I know a little bit about being involved with the paranormal. I often do a lot of historical research because you have to. You find things out on paranormal investigations, and you want to validate them. And I know that after the Second World War, there was no money about. London had been absolutely flattened, as had all the cities. So the demand for bricks was particularly high. And all these great big country houses were sitting sort of virtually empty, costing an arm and a leg to heat and keep. So a lot of the bits which weren't used were knocked down, and the bricks were then sold and used for rebuilding the country after World War II. And I think that was probably the truth. And he wouldn't want to come around and say, "Oh, I haven't got any money. I'm going to knock down some of the house to." He wouldn't want that. So the story came out that he was he believed the house was inhabited by a werewolf, and this is factual. You can actually check this out. What was interesting is local folklore, and this again is in the book, Scott. I don't know if you've read the Hingingbrooke story. Local folklore says that a werewolf was discovered, but they couldn't kill it. And so what they did was, he said, "We'll get rid of it." And they shot it, they stabbed it, but it wouldn't die. They had it netted. And so according to local folklore, they took it in a way and dumped it in a wood called Monk's Wood, which is about 3 or 5 miles away. Now, in later years, this became an American air base called RAF Alconbury.
Okay, yeah.
And in the 1970s, I think 1974 off the top of my head, they reported a wolf-like creature on what they call the hard top, which we call a runway here in the UK for aircraft to take off. And the local newspaper, these 5 airmen, they held nuclear warheads at Alconbury at that time in the 70s. So, you know, security was very high. So it was a huge event. Shots were fired. So there was an inquiry. And the local Hunts Post newspaper hired a police artist to come and draw what these, I think there was 5 security guards said they saw. And it's in the book, Scott, in the if you look up Alconbury, RAF Alconbury. And when I was researching the book through Facebook, I've made contact with people who were there at that time, and they can remember this story. I've got one individual, I've got his name, and he told me that one of his friends was one of the security guards, and you know, he told him what he'd witnessed. I have that on a slide somewhere, Scott. I can send it to you if you want.
If you could, Mark, I can pass it.
Yeah. Now, these American airmen that were on guard, they were drug tested and, you know, tested for alcohol and everything like that. And there were shots fired. And this creature apparently jumped a fence that was 6 to 7 foot high. It just jumped over it back into the woods. So, yeah, it's quite interesting. But, you know, the story about the werewolf at Hingingbrooke, I think that's folklore. And I think that was, yeah.
I was just wondering.
I put it in the book because it is factual. It's recorded that he'd said that he felt it was I think it was, he got a gamekeeper that lodged in the West Wing, and he felt
there
that there.
I know it's kind of hard to see.
That was drawn by a police artist based on the description of what these 5 airmen said that they witnessed, and you can see the perimeter fence behind it. It was allegedly, it leapt that in one bound and disappeared into the woods.
It looks huge.
Well, apparently one American thought it was a man and drove next to it in his Jeep and rolled down the window and the creature turned its head and looked at him, and he realised what it was, and it frightened him to death. And then this creature bounded off and jumped this fence. So it was documented and made the local Hunts Post newspaper, and that picture was published in the newspaper in the 70s.
Yeah.
And when I was doing my research in Huntingdon Library in the archives, I came across that photo, and that's what it comes from. But if you go into Google and you put Hingingbrooke House werewolf, you'll find the Hunts Post story.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll definitely have to look that up. Now, the reason why I ask is because a lot of stories are at least in your guys' neck of the woods, deal with a lot of hauntings that are hundreds or thousands of years old. And I didn't know if this particular house had anything that's more of a recent haunting or something that was more not so old. And that's why I was curious.
Yeah, what is interesting is just literally a mile north from me is a place called Diddington. It's a tiny, tiny little village. And during the Second World War, an American military hospital sprang up there. To give you an idea of the size of this hospital, the village had got a population of 70. And when this hospital sprang up, it had 1,000 beds. It was the second biggest military hospital in the Second World War. Mainly American airmen who were flying over occupied Germany and France, and they were getting injuries that they weren't life-threatening, but they were serious enough to mean that they wouldn't take any part in the war. So they were nursed back to health in this hospital, and then they were flown back to the States. And interestingly enough, there's a very interesting ghost story there relating to an American airman who was known as Mikey. And so that is a fairly recent haunting, and he was tragically killed there, and they reckoned that his ghost, he was actually a vehicle fell on top of him and pinned him, a big army truck, and that he died as a result of this accident. And they said that when people returned to the camp, you could hear his screams and that from the area where he perished. And the hospital was only there for about a year, and then when the hospital moved, it became a Polish refugee camp. And you probably won't know this, Jennifer, but in the UK there's a famous soap opera called Coronation Street, and one of the actresses in there is a lady called Rula Lenska. She was Polish, and she was born in this hospital. When the hospital went, it then became a Polish refugee camp, because obviously the Germans had decimated Poland, so we had a lot of refugees. And even when it was a refugee camp, this ghost supposedly was heard his cries of pain and agony with this vehicle on top of him. It took about 3 hours for him to die, apparently, and they managed to squeeze him out by, there was nothing on the hospital site to lift this army vehicle. It was so big that they actually got as many people as they could to inch it up so they could slide the guy out. But his chest had caved in and he expired, sadly. But according to the story, and my grandfather told me this, in the 1950s, his family came over from the States to visit the site, the hospital, and it was like they took his spirit home with them back to America. The cries and that were never heard after his family visited. Wow. So it was almost like they came and collected him and took him back to America. They owned a large car dealership. I think it was a Chevrolet dealership, or a very, and he was a mechanic, and he was so skilled that he was nearly blind. His injury, he was 90% blind, but he was one of those people who could listen to an engine and tell you what was wrong with it. So he had that skill because him and his family had worked with motor cars. And yeah, they had quite a big dealership, I think, in the States, and they came over to visit, where they'd lost their son. And they say that after they returned back to America, this thing never happened anymore. It was as if he found peace and returned back with them. Very interesting and sad story.
Oh, I like sad
stories. But that American hospital, you'll be familiar with this, Jennifer. This tiny little village, Diddington, population of 70 people. They had 1,000-bed hospital, and Bing Crosby and Bob Hope turned up there to entertain the sick and the wounded during the Second World War. So that's literally just a mile up the road from me. And I knew about the hospital. When I researched the book, I was flabbergasted to think that Bing Crosby and Bob Hope had appeared. The hospital was so large it had its own cinema, and Bob Hope and Bing Crosby appeared there. As I said, you have to really know Diddington. You could pass it and blink, you would miss it. You wouldn't see it. It's that. And to think that superstars like them who were famous in America had appeared and performed in such a small village is just a bit mind-blowing, particularly as it's probably a mile from where I grew up. So, and I didn't know that till I started researching the book. I knew the hospital, but I didn't know its history. So that was quite fascinating.
It's quite mind-blowing. I mean, where we stay, well, I'm originally from Glasgow, but I moved to Ayrshire about 7 years ago. I was just saying it's tiny. And there's a town nearby us, it's about 10 minutes away, called Prestwick. It's not a major major town. It's a seaside resort kind of thing. And that's where Elvis landed. It's what?
What?
Well, the reason I talk is because I've got an American link here. I worked for 25 years for a company that I'm sure Jennifer will know called DuPont. And one of our biggest customers printed circuit boards in Prestwick. They were called Prestwick circuits. They probably still trade. I don't know. They've become
no idea. That's 10 minutes away from us, and that's where actually Elvis landed to refuel way back to America in 1960.
No, I'm just putting all these little pins in going, okay, I'm going to visit this, I'm going to visit that, I want to visit here. Oh man, no, I just love I love the history. That's why I always ask about how old hauntings actually are, or what is actually known with a haunting. Because where I'm at, a lot of the hauntings can be fairly new to no more than 200, well, not quite 200 years old on the West Coast of the United States. So that's why I ask.
It's funny actually because.
Carry on, buddy. I was going to say, obviously, we're doing in March. January to investigate and film there. What's the atmosphere like in Hingingbrooke? How you go into some of these old buildings, the atmosphere immediately changes. I'll give you an example.
It does do that.
The atmosphere
when you turn the lights on in that place, Scott, the atmosphere just changes dramatically. It really does. That's one thing I can say about it, particularly if you go in somewhere like the cellars, which is absolutely pitch black. You can see on the Paranormal Lockdown TV show Groff groping about in the dark. We can see him on a night vision camera, but you can see that he can see absolutely nothing. And, he's hearing sounds and it's spooking him really. But,
that's the one I want to go. I want to get, that's one, excuse me, when we come down, that's the one place I want to go down is into the cellars. I love basements, cellars, Yeah.
When I took people on these tours, I was taking people down there, 15 people at a time. I couldn't get them out of it because it's quite large and it's just as if time has stood still for 400 or 500 years. It's exactly as it was. Even the sort of banister is made of metal and the metal is rusted through. The banister has been stabilized. It was loose, but to meet the requirements to take people down there, we had to stabilize the banister. We had to put some form of lighting in. We had to make sure that the areas of the brick floor that had dropped were basically level. There's still some areas where you go down an inch or two, but now it's lit. And I said to people when they come on this, look, you must bring a handheld torch with you. When we're down here and you're moving around, although there's light and you can see reasonably well, you can quite easily put your foot down one of these holes. In the actual larder areas and where the ice house is at the back, there is no lighting at all. So a torch is essential. You couldn't move around in there because there's various bits and bobs around. You trip over, you go down holes. It literally is just like time has stood still there. It's really funny actually, because there's an old chair in the cellar made of what I would call plywood, and God knows how long it's been down there. But on one of the tours, there was fungus growing on it because it's been there so long. And this lady on the tour was a microbiologist, and she identified this fungus, and she's, I can't go, I've got to take pictures of this fungus. So we're down in the cellar, and she's probably taking pictures of the newest thing that's down there, which is probably 30, 50 years old. It's probably been there certainly since the school opened, and it's got all this white fungus growing on it, which apparently is quite rare. And so there's all these people taking pictures of the cellars and everything, and she's taking pictures of the fungus growing on the chair. And there is, because it's below ground, there is some plant growth on the walls, so it sort of resembles a large spider web in places. So it's a fascinating place, the cellar. And I literally couldn't get these people out. I'm thinking, well, I've got 15 more people waiting upstairs to come down. I've got to move people on. But it was hell's hardest job to get them out. You'll love it. I promise you, Scott, you'll love it in there. I think when people see it's one of those places. Once you've been in and you see it, yeah.
Excuse me.
You want to get back again after once you've been and seen it? It sticks in your head.
Well, I think it's a fantastic opportunity for serious UK paranormal teams to come into a fantastic place that's 1,000 years old. 3 English monarchs have slept there. I think there's another 3 monarchs. Elizabeth I has slept there. Who else has slept there? Charles I slept there. He was a captive then. He was in the English Civil War, being captured, and he was on his way to a place called Newmarket, which is known for its horse riding. It's a short distance from Cambridge, and they basically stopped the night at Hingingbrooke. So there's 3 monarchs that have slept there, and about another 3 who visited. Samuel Pepys, the diarist, who you probably recognise his name more than people would in America. Very, very famous, because he wrote a diary for 9 years when these important events like the plague, and he was living in London then, so he kept meticulous records, and they're the best records that we have. And so they are kept under lock and key in a university in Cambridge, which is probably about 18 miles east of me here. His original diaries are there, and he actually made some of his diary entries on the steps at the rear of the building at Hingingbrooke. And we know this because they're written in the diaries. He says, I'm sitting on the steps at Hingingbrooke, making this entry. So the beauty is about Pepys is he was a meticulous recorder. He recorded things in such detail. So his diaries are so valuable because they give us the biggest insight to the Dutch invading London, to the Great Plague of London, and the Great Fire that followed it. They're the best records we have in English history, which is, he only kept a diary. Most people seem to be under the impression he kept diaries all his life. He only kept diaries from 1660 to 1669. And during those 3 years, those important events happened in London. He was actually also a witness to Charles I getting his head chopped off by Oliver Cromwell. He stood in the crowd and watched that happen as a young boy. He was in his teens, but an execution was like James Bond film coming out now. It was big business. Everybody wanted to turn up to see King Charles have his head chopped off. So huge interest.
It was. The execution. It was a big thing, but back then, execution. It was. It was what a day out. Basically, people would come from near and far and gather for early in the morning to witness this, and
bigger like Glastonbury.
That's what it was. Yeah. And it was only I say recently was the authorities decided to swap executions from being public to private, basically, inside a prison,
Yeah.
because the amount of people that were actually gathering to watch some guy losing his head or getting hung or, whatever. And young kids, families used to take young children. Come on, we're going tomorrow to see a guy get his head chopped off. And
Scott, they had public executions in the 1800s or almost late 1800s. I forgot when the last public execution took place, but they did it for a long time in America.
Yeah.
So.
Well, then, there's a very interesting. There's a very interesting story about. Yeah, there's a very interesting story about Pepys as well. That when the Dutch were coming, he was living in London when the Dutch were invading, sailing up the Thames, and he told his wife and his father to take all their valuables, their money, and take it to Huntingdonshire, to his uncle's cottage. His dad's brother lived probably just barely 2 miles from Hingingbrooke House, and he told them to take the money there and to bury it. And they didn't bury it in one hole. They buried it in various locations and didn't keep good records of where they'd buried it all. So if you look at my book and you look at the Huntingdon chapter, the Brampton chapter.
I love it. He keeps pulling his book. I love it. It's great.
It's an amazing book. I've read about half it, and it's amazing.
Yeah, each chapter starts with the village sign. And the village sign for Brampton shows the race course, because there's Huntingdon race course is actually in Brampton. And it also shows Samuel Pepys scrabbling on the ground looking for his gold. He is supposed to haunt the Black Bull pub in Brampton and also St Mary Magdalene's church right next door, which is where a lot of people think that the churchyard was extended, and they think that some of this treasure is actually buried in the churchyard. So I remember in the 1980s, because some of this money has been recovered, they found a load of silver hidden in a wall at the back of Pepys' cottage. And because Pepys' cottage is not too far from the church, he could have probably left the pub, the Black Bull, cut through the churchyard, and he'd be in the paddock that led to the back of his brother's cottage. And so yeah, this money was buried, and the village sign, as I said, if you look at the Brampton chapter, you'll see the village sign that exists, and it's got Samuel Pepys on it looking for his gold.
Oh, how funny.
So it's still there somewhere to this day. Some of it is still.
Well, the funny thing was, Scott, I remember in the 1980s when metal detectors first became popular. There was all these people in the paddock with these metal detectors. Whether they found anything or not, I guess if they did, they weren't going to declare it. But I know that there was a hoard of silver of his that was found hidden in a brick wall. I think it was in the foundations of the wall, and I think a metal detector discovered that. It was sort of almost buried under the wall, but the detector picked it up, and they dug down by the side of the wall and found all this silver. But yeah, there are people that say they've seen his ghost in this St Mary Magdalene church, looking down at the ground and looking agitated. And people naturally assume he's looking for his money, which his dad and his wife stupidly hid all over the place and didn't keep, good records. I think he also was allegedly buried a large wheel of Parmesan cheese, which was also very, very valuable at that time. So yeah, there's a story about people. Parmesan cheese is like huge, big wheel of it. Allegedly, yeah. And again, we know all this information because of his diary. He documented all this so meticulously.
He was
also a serial womanizer, and he writes about all his mistresses in great detail.
Okay. Wow.
So much so that a lot of the diaries were written in foreign languages or in a code because he didn't want his wife to read them. And people who have, if you go online and you look at some of these diaries, people describe it as pornography, because he writes in such detail about what he got up to with his mistresses. Yeah, he was a big ladies' man. Yeah, he liked the ladies, did Samuel Pepys.
Need to get a hold of that then, have a look at that one.
Yeah.
On that note, I think we'll wind it up there for tonight. No, unless you get any questions for Mark, Jennifer.
I'm sorry. I was looking up the book to see if it's available, or the diary.
Or the Samuel Pepys.
Yeah, you can. It's on Amazon. Everything's on Amazon.
If you look online, Jennifer,
Yeah,
you can see the diary online, and there are websites that show the date, and they'll show the date. You know, like today's date is the 18th of October, and it'll show you the entries he made on the 18th of October for those 1660 to 1669. So you can look every day and see what he did on those, you know, for 9 years on that day.
That's very amazing.
It's fascinating. And so much detail. The detail is incredible. He writes in such detail.
But as I said, we'll wind it up there. Just before we go, just a couple of things. Penny say, I'm trying to put a comment. I just had a quick look. It has it daily on there, as Mark says. There you go, Jennifer. Daily reading for you. Thanks to Mark for coming in. See, we're going down to Hingingbrooke House on the 29th of January to investigate and film now, which we're over. All teams over the moon about doing it. We'll be the first team since Paranormal Lockdown was there. Thanks, Dr. Melissa Doll. As you know, we were in Nottingham at the weekend. We met up with GSI, our good friends from Nottingham, and we done a wee bit of filming that about with them on October 30 and 31st on Amazon Prime. It's called In Search Of. A really fantastic visit. Sherwood Forest is an amazing place. You know, so we're live again on Monday with Jennifer.
Again? Yeah, probably. But I have no idea what we're doing on Monday.
We were talking about it last night.
Oh, never mind. Okay, I'm sorry. Brain just. It's been a long day today.
It's been a long day. Monday night we're live and we're talking about haunted locations that made big stories but turned out to be damp floods, basically.
Basically fake ghost stories.
Yeah. We're live on Monday night. And next weekend is Halloween. Don't forget, as everybody knows, we have got a very special weekend planned for you. Kind of a very different weekend. And so, that's it. Oh, I'm on an interview this Thursday on Paranormal Path with Jacqueline Dixon and Lou Haddle. That's on Paranormal Path on Facebook. I'm going on for a wee chat with them. And that's what we've got going on just now. But Mark will be back next month with his buddy for a wee history spot on your book, the 4 location spot.
Yeah, or whatever you want to talk about. Because I obviously, I'm going actually to, this is quite interesting, this Friday, I'm going to Rainham Hall in Norfolk. Nice. I don't know if you're familiar with the brown lady of Rainham Hall, that photograph. That's a very famous ghost photo that was taken in the 1930s by the Country Life magazine in Norfolk. Very famous ghost photo called the Brown Lady of Rainham Hall, that's taken on the stairs. And I'm actually going to go and visit. The last time I was there, Scott, was in the 80s, before mobile phones. So I haven't got any photographs, but I plan while I'm there to take a lot of photographs, and I shall put them on one of my Facebook pages, and I'll share them there with you.
Hear about it.
I was just going to say that, Mark. If you would, just before we go, if you want to tell people about your Facebook pages, how they can get in contact with you and how they can look you up.
Yeah, well, I started a Facebook page when the book came out 4 years ago, and it's called The Haunted History of Huntingdonshire. So if you search that, it's a bit of a mouthful, but if you search that,
Got it.
everything in that group is Huntingdonshire. But if you go into the group, there's a pinned post, and it directs you to another group called Haunted Histories. Now that covers the whole of the UK and occasionally outside of UK's, but generally speaking, it's the UK.
Cool.
So it's places like Rainham Hall that I visited, Kimbolton Castle, basically all over the UK. And I keep a similar format to the book. I generally write about 300 to 500 words on the history and the hauntings, and then I include lots of photos. So when I go to these places, when I'm in these buildings, I like to get as many photos. And of course now, you've got mobile phone. It's so easy to do compared to how it was. But yeah, I'm going to Rainham on Friday, so I'm going to spend my Friday afternoon and evening at Rainham, and I shall take some photos.
Oh, I can't wait to hear what you find.
I look forward to seeing them. So, give Mark's pages a wee look up. They're well worth it. You won't be disappointed. The guy does know his stuff, as we say in Scotland. He really is paranormal and history. There's not much a guy doesn't know, basically. And I'm not saying that because he's sitting on our panel. I'm saying that because it's true, basically. So Perry as well says, thank you, it's been real interesting. So thanks very much to everybody who came into the chat. So we're back live again on Monday, Jennifer and I, and whoever else wants to join us. And I'm on
we need to get what happened to the rest of the team? They need to get on.
Don't worry, I'll get the whip out. Whoop-ah! Get the whip out. Or whatever the word is.
Right.
And I'll be talking with Jacqueline and Lou on Thursday on Paranormal Path. So until next Monday or Thursday, take care, folks. And thanks to Jennifer, and a massive thanks to Mark, as always. And you'll be seeing him again next month for another wee chat about history or whatever we decide to chat about, basically.
Perhaps talk about Rainham Hall.
Yes.
We can talk about that.
You set it up.
Join us next month. And Mark will tell you all about Rainham Hall. Sorted. That saves me thinking. That job done.
Yeah, obviously everything in one of the Facebook groups is Huntingdonshire. Everything in there is Huntingdonshire based because that's where I live. But the other group, I think there's about 10,000 people following the two groups together now. So it's grown. I thought probably there'd be 30, 50 people interested, and it's just been for 4 years. It's 10,000 people, and the biggest group is Haunted Histories because that goes outside of Huntingdonshire, so it goes all over the UK. I feature castles, haunted buildings, famous hauntings, less known hauntings, and basically everywhere I go. And I tend to shoot off for 2 or 3 weeks at a time and travel up one part of England and stop off at these places and investigate, take photos, and then basically put on reports of what I discovered and some of the history of the hauntings, which people seem to like.
Well, that's it. You give details about where you've been, what you've done, show photographs, and what we usually 10,000 followers. It's a lot of people. So it's a lot of people. I think we're 25 or 26 off of 2,000. Yeah, Jennifer, I think we're nearly the 2,000 mark.
Something like that, yeah.
So we just need another 24, 25 people or something. we can hit.
One of the things I have noticed, Scott, and it's probably due to social media platforms like Facebook and whatever, is that I've been involved with the paranormal since the 70s, and I've never known it's so popular. I mean, very much in the early days, I didn't really tell people what I did because people looked at you as if you were mentally ill. What are you doing sitting around in old houses looking for ghosts? Are you mad? But nowadays, it's all in the open, and I've never known the paranormal so popular as it is now.
It's funny you say that because we had Sophia temporarily on a couple of weeks ago. She's coming back next month, but I talk to her quite regular, and we were talking about that as well, especially during the last year, 12 to 14, 15 months with what's been happening. Also, we don't talk about it. With what's happened, social media. Sophie and I were talking, and we did with social media is it certainly helped our channel, the way we're growing. But it's brought out a lot of interest in the paranormal. But sometimes for the wrong reason, most of the time for the good reason. And I dare say it's the same in America as well.
It is, unfortunately.
Yeah, you find that I think there's a lot of people that had paranormal experiences that historically wouldn't share them with people because they were frightened of being judged as being, mentally ill or whatever, or liars or whatever you want to say. But now it's sort of come out that a lot more people have had these experiences and more people are talking about it, that I think people are a little bit more open-minded as regards it. I think the paranormal is something that even if your best friend who you trust with your life comes in and tells you they've just seen a ghost, you say to them, what have you been thinking? Are you well? And stuff like that. And, they're your best friend. And I think that the people are generally talking about it a lot more. I still have to say that seeing a ghost, in my opinion, is very, very rare. I've seen one in over 40 years. Poltergeist activity, I've witnessed that a lot more. I think that's more common than people think, but not extreme poltergeist. People think of the Enfield haunting and they think of beds and chairs and tables. That's extreme poltergeist. That's very, very rare.
It's very interesting.
Subtle poltergeist.
Over here, poltergeist activity isn't as common as actual ghost sightings. So that's completely the opposite. I've seen more ghosts than actual, poltergeist activity.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I think the poltergeist activity is very subtle at times, and sometimes people describe it as just one of those things and don't really look into it and say, well, actually, if you analyze what I've just seen, there's no explanation for it. Either we've had an earthquake.
I've had my share where I've tried to debunk and can't debunk, and I'm like, okay. But anyway, I can't stick around. I got things I have to do. So
that's fair. We're just going to wind it up there anyway. Just now. So again, thanks, Mark. A million thanks for coming in. And Jennifer, always a pleasure to share a panel with you, my dear. And we're back Monday night, folks. So until then, take care and stay safe, everybody. Bye.
Bye.